My name is Chris. I'm the deputy editor of PC Gamer, and I've written for places like Edge, Games Radar, and OXM. You might also know me as a voice on the Crate and Crowbar podcast. I started out in games as a generalist writer with really arty leanings, and somehow I've ended up as PCG's chief esports guy. I write a weekly column about Dota called 3 Lane Highway, and I've been watching teenagers earn millions of dollars by clicking on the right wizards for almost 2 years. I've decided to call my talk But Is It Sport? In the hope that you'll be forced to remember the time when But Are Games Art was a subject with almost unlimited hot take potential, often triggered by the involvement of film critic Roger Ebert in our hobby, albeit momentary, the late critic Roger Ebert. Along those lines, however, I could have just as well called this talk Are Esports Sports? Are Eberts Berts? Which is actually a better title that I didn't think of until yesterday. There is, however, a fairly serious point here, despite having played it for laughs. Discussions like this often become completely about language, where something small, like the movement of a vowel, distracts from the pursuit of actual understanding. Authorities are consulted in order to furnish us with definitions. Those definitions are used to establish authority, and that authority is used to make a point that somebody will take issue with, and opposing authorities are consulted, and so on. If you woke up one day like I did in possession of a humanities degree, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Often, in particular in the case of games, these arguments are made in pursuit of validation for the medium. For example, video games are sport because according to the Olympic Committee, chess is a sport. Video games and chess are sedentary activities. The Olympics and chess both carry cultural value. Therefore, it is churlish of you, Dad, to consider my above-average destiny kill-death ratio, that's real, as anything less than a cultural milestone. This is not sufficient as criticism, in the same way that a game of pass the parcel is not sufficient as socialism. It's word association. We, as people who are interested in games, as critical of games, got past this in the case of Are Games Art? Games exist that make the semantic or validatory argument irrelevant. The questions we ask now consider the effect of art, the intent behind art, the social, cultural, historical messages transmitted by art, the way that art fails, succeeds, and so on. We are generally more occupied by what games of this kind do than what they might be according to some external referent. Games criticism has become active in its exploration of the art of games rather than passive in its pursuit of or submission to an external authority. I don't quite think that games as sport is there yet. In many instances, it's still stuck at that earlier stage, looking for validation. A couple of weeks ago, Blizzard launched Heroes of the Storm, there you go, as a spectator sport with its Heroes of the Dorm competition. Like Riot, they're going, who make League of Legends, they're going for the college esports varsity thing in the US. It was broadcast on the US sports TV network ESPN, as was last year's Dota 2 International. And as such, it caused a surge in articles and videos along these lines. Are games actually sport? Do they deserve this platform? Is this appropriate? And so on. Many of these, and though I won't pick up on individuals, Total Biscuit, miss the point. Games are not sport because the programming director at ESPN thinks they'll bring in numbers for their network. Consider how much music is actually on MTV. Equally, they're not sports because ESPN's audience doesn't recognize them as such. After all, that isn't music is the oldest criticism leveraged at every new form of music, from rap to rock and roll to EDM. The novel wasn't considered literature for a long time, and so on. Arguments like this, furthermore, aren't useful because they don't give you a reason to want that question, but is it sport, answered. You don't gain anything from reaching an understanding that depends entirely on external reference points. I'm just going to give our emergency services a chance to pass the building. Thank you. Doing fine work. The more advanced arguments consider, for example, that esports represent a new commercial direction for games, and that this hews to the model of traditional sports, and therefore games must be sport for business reasons. This is better, but it still relies on money, profit margins, and so on to validate that core point. As such, I don't think it's particularly useful to us in terms of how we understand games. The reason then, I'm getting to the point, to ask if games are sport is to arrive at a better understanding of what games are, how people relate to them, and to contextualize them as part of the history of human creativity. In doing so, we can enhance our own appreciation of games, discover new experiences to explore, and potentially become inspired to adopt new ideas or structures for our own projects if we're developers. This is what I gained from discovering that yes, games can be sport. The experience has been quite an important one to me, and it's certainly changed the way I view games as a critic. I can't promise to transmit exactly the same effect to you, but I'd be delighted if the critical approach I'm about to outline, or at least the philosophy of what games might be that I'm about to outline, sparked even a couple of new ideas. As I gestured at the start of this talk, I was in no way a sports guy when I came to this profession. I was interested in film criticism, in art and authored narrative, and so on. Not only did I not have an answer for the big question here, I wouldn't even think to ask it. I had a second-hand technical understanding of sport, but no attachment to make me consider it further. Take this image, for example. Right. School rugby. I could supplement any traditional sporting image here, but I've chosen this one because it's the closest to my experience as a teenager. I could look at this and see what I've put up above. Physical development, personal discipline, social engagement, drama through competition, even the expression of cultural values. But what I really see when I look at this is that. Which is why I'm a games journalist now. So, skip forward a couple of years to this moment, which is the end of the third Dota 2 International in 2013. This was the first esports event that I'd ever covered as a journalist. If there are any Dota guys here, they will know that this tournament had like a fairy tale ending, if you like a certain type of Dota. If you're not aware and you'd like me to explain it, come find me after, because I don't want to fill out the rest of this evening with a dramatic recreation of Alliance's triumphant victory. The salient point, however, is that as I stood there and that trophy was lifted, as the music played and confetti rained down, I realized that that was the most exciting and emotive experience I'd had in connection to a video game. It was almost also one of the most emotional experiences I'd had in an arts venue. The old venue for the International was Benaroya Hall in Seattle, which is a traditional concert venue. And I'm used to working in the theatre. I'm familiar with the effect that music and lighting have in coordination with action that takes place on a stage. But this wasn't that. I saw all of these elements that I understood, but realized that they amounted to something different in this context. In that moment, I didn't just start seeing games as sport, I finally figured out what sport was. Esports helped me to understand that sport as a whole is simply a form of performative creativity. It's part of a continuum that also includes theatre and improv, live action, safe performances of human experience. To dip briefly back into language, which is a danger zone, but we'll go with it, consider the double meaning of the word play. It's a verb in sport and in video games, but it's a noun in the theatre. But it's the same word, and it's part of the same history of thought. I am now, for reasons that seemed like a really good idea yesterday, going to attempt to dramatize that history of thought with a brief dialogue between two medieval peasants. Our villagers are called Carol and Anthony. I was going to do a little cartoon for this, but it's so out of my remit as a human being that I've just written that. "What's that, Carol?" asks Anthony. "It's a sheep," replies Carol. Anthony looks puzzled. "It doesn't look like a sheep to me." "I have modded the sheep," explains Carol. "It's a ball now." "But what does it do?" asks Anthony. "I've made it roll. See, I've kicked it. And now it's over there." Anthony considers this. "What do we do with it?" "I'm glad you asked," replies Carol. "I suggest that we kick it until it is no longer in our village, but in a different village. Then we will invite the inhabitants of that village to kick the ball all the way back to our village. At first, we will do this simply for the joy of it. We will do it in order to see our will made manifest in the physical world, if only this simple, small way. Then, we, or somebody like us, will develop rules. These rules will establish correct and incorrect methods of engagement with the sheep ball, and through them we will achieve the basic framework required for both organized competition and the expression of individual skill, growth, and understanding." Carol continues. "These three core concepts, playful engagement with systems that exist beyond us, safe conflict, and the drama of personal development, will ultimately amount to a powerful expression of what it means to be subject to physical, social, and personal constraint. My sheep ball, Anthony, is a tool to be used in the safe expression of the drama of human experience." "Right," considers Anthony. "But that's why I go to the theatre, which exists now. It's also why I go to church. There are plenty of places I can go to have conflict, which is essentially what you're describing, expressed to me in a manner that is safe, informative, and accessible." "Correct," says Carol. "The advantage of my sheep ball, however, is that it presents a systemic solution. It is a prop in a play that has rules in place of a script. As such, the drama it supports is both authorless and non-verbal. It's not subject to individual whim or the exclusive consequences of language. It's procedurally generated open-source drama with no native operating system." "But Carol," says Anthony, "we're very much used to thinking of creative power as one way. In particular, we esteem the act of individual authorship. Scarcity, we believe, carries value. Is there not, therefore, a risk that these two methods of responding to the world, while analogous to one another in many ways, will stratify? Will we not end up with your democratic solution thought of as low, despite of, even because of, its popularity? Will we not end up with divisions entrenched by changing cultural perspectives on the value of the body, the mind, the individual, the group, and so on? That may well be, Carroll concedes. However, these new ideas are not totally mutually exclusive. It's possible that, should circumstances and technology allow it, my systemic drama could benefit from some of the trappings of didactic creativity, particularly the dramatic images, analogies, and elements of cultural shorthand that we've developed in order to express conflict in other media. That would require technological advancements in the staging of this drama that my medieval mind is incapable of fathoming. However, it sounds rad, and so, Dota. I'm going to unpack some of that now. Sport is a system for generating dramatic narrative. It does this using rules rather than scripts. It goes so far that sport is defined by rules. Kicking, throwing, and clicking are actions or activities, variously physical, but not sport in and of themselves. Sport, as I understand it, is what happens when you apply rules to activity in order to pursuit of a system that generates drama. This provides a clear link to a certain type of video game experience, but also to board games and card games and so on. Insofar as it's useful to distinguish sport from entertainment, then, the line is a narrow one if this is where we stop. The next point, then, is that sports are communally owned. In traditional sport, this is mostly obvious. We don't talk about Carroll Football, the inventor of football, or the latest version of tennis to be released by Tennis Inc. But it applies elsewhere, and particularly in the case of video game criticism, this opens up new ways to understand the ways that games develop. The vast majority of esports offer more game modes, maps, and features as games than they do as sports. Counter-Strike, Dota, League, StarCraft, and so on all operate differently when they are played this way. The rules change, whether that regards which maps are played, which characters can be selected, or how many players are involved. These rules constitute the game as a sport, but they are often which is often community-derived and officiated by some kind of external authority after the fact. This is exactly how modern football works. FIFA arbitrates rules that originated with the players of the game. You could say the same of Dota, a competitive game developed by the community and now officiated by Valve. To take this point further, it's notable how many successful esports have their origin as mods. The entire MOBA genre stems from the decision to find a new competitive way to play StarCraft and subsequently Warcraft. The most popular competitive shooter started off as a mod for Half-Life. What's important, however, is that even the games that originate entirely from a single developer, for example StarCraft or Street Fighter, have a sport form that the community plays a lead role in determining. I roll my eyes whenever a developer sends me a press release announcing that they're making a new esport. This is the same as announcing that you're making a meme. You don't get to decide that, the community does. This, then, as a games journalist, is incredibly liberating. Perceiving games as sport frees me from the commercial and evaluative nature of this position. It allows me to focus entirely on the experience of play and the human stories that emerge from play, rather than how many levels there are or whether the story is good. Football, after all, is either a game with one map and shit textures, or it's a sport and that doesn't matter. Players benefit from this as well. In the majority of cases, a game is something you receive from a developer, something you consume. Sport is one of the key ways that games become the property of their players. This needn't be limited to official pro gaming communities and their governing bodies either. Whether you come up with house rules to facilitate competition, you're embracing with the game in the manner of a sport. Traditional sports happen when somebody applies rules to physics. Esports happen when somebody applies rules to a game engine. It's a directly analogous process in my mind. Just as with games as art, then, games as sport demonstrates another way in which the medium is breaking free of its commercial roots. In fact, games are unique in the way that they bridge these two different approaches to creativity or the expression of conflict. Something like Dota represents a messy marriage of the two. It has the structure of sport with a single pitch, fixed competitive rules, and so on, but that pitch is populated by swordsmen, wizards, monsters, attack helicopters, and bears, traditional and not so traditional dramatic symbols. I don't, in conclusion, think it's likely that esports will demolish traditional conceptions of what is and isn't a sport, or establish a widespread understanding of the link between art and sport, high culture and low culture, and so on. But I do think they're a great example of the potential of interactive media, how deeply games are related not just to older cultural forms, but to the spark that inspired those cultural forms in the first place, how they allow us to return to those forms, basic forms of creative performance, and use technology to spin them out in new directions. In order to appreciate that fully, we should be willing to open up the dictionary to games, to allow the medium to invade terms like art or sport, and to change our understanding of them. The interesting question then isn't, but is it sport? It's what can be achieved now that it is. Thank you very much. Cool. Hands up, I guess. This guy in the hat. This is new.
Do you think the journalism side of these esports has a part to play in kind of validating it to the outside world or people that don't necessarily understand games?
So in the sense that journalism should be acting as an advocate for esports, or that it finds itself slipping into that?
Or do you think it kind of adds to the sport nature of it?
So, I mean, the way I've addressed sport here is as a creative form, right? Like, there's a lot of cultural trappings that come with sport. Many are actually undesirable, and I know that'll be talked about in a later talk today. So, as for journalism, like, I don't think journalism has an obligation to put forward one understanding or another of what games are and can be. I think it has the obligation to present stories that are factually true and emotionally resonant, and that resonate with the audience that wants to read them. And I think things that I got out of this was this faster route to human stories through just seeing games as sport, cutting out the evaluative part of it. As I said, you train yourself as a games journalist to think, but how good is the story? How many levels are there? What is the value proposition of this commercial project? When you're freed from that and you can just go, how does this make that person feel who's just won this tournament? How does it make this person feel who's now crushed beyond belief because they didn't win? That's so much more interesting. It's basically skipping to the end. It feels like cheating. Like you don't have to do the preamble where you fill in you tick all the boxes that are expected of you as a traditional commercial games journalist. Any other questions? Yeah.
What do you think of the way that a lot of esports are not necessarily stealing, but co-opting things from more traditional sports, like uniforms, like setting up rivalries, that sort of thing?
So, do you mean like in terms of developing the narrative? Like that I think is probably one of the only inheritances from traditional sport that's almost completely unproblematic. There are other things, but I don't want to step on any toes that'll be gotten to. But in terms of it's not. Those ideas of people walking out into a public eye wearing uniforms, fighting for their side, and with a narrative that's built around that, with inter-team rivalries and the drama of exchanges and people forming fantasy leagues and things like that, that is all really tried and true territory for traditional sport that we get a lot out of in esports, because it just works as a generator of drama. And in a way, it kind of highlights the point I'm making, that at that point, the drama has almost nothing to do with the game that is sitting beneath it. The game is the set of physical rules, basically, that allow that drama to happen, but the drama is ultimately interpersonal and about people. If that answers your question. Anyone else? Tom?
Where do you stand on the objective sport in terms of whether it's to win or to entertain?
That's a question for players, I think, rather than, because this is, an interesting thing is that sport can only function if it's entertainment for an audience, if there are people that are willing to pay for it, if they're willing to pay for the prize pools that bring more people in, and so on. The objectives of players should always be to win, because that drive, that kind of singular focus, is what drives the drama that creates entertainment. If players are trying to game the system by manufacturing narrative, then I suspect it would collapse in on itself, like a bad improv skit where everyone's second-guessing each other. However, there are instances where, for example, a bad tournament structure can mean that two players get into a situation in the middle of a bracket where they no longer have to try because it doesn't matter if they win or lose. That's something for tournament organizations to consider and stamp out completely where possible, basically, because that is directly counter to the kind of dramatic entertainment of the thing. And it's not something the player should worry about. If a player finds themselves in that situation, then...
So would you say the player's objective is to win, but the official's objective is to make the game happen?
Yeah, like the people organising these tournaments are there to organise entertainment for people to watch, and the players are a kind of a piece in that. The tournament organisers should only expect to move in one direction, and that's towards the trophy. It's their responsibility to structure the rest of that event, like game designers, so that the players ultimately create the best possible experience for not just for themselves, but for people watching as well. Any other questions? Yes.
What about, there's a lot of sports that aren't really spectator sports, like they're fun to play and entertaining, but not if you're watching. Yeah, how does that fit into when it comes to games?
So hang on, so can you give me an example of the type of game you're talking about?
Well, okay. Maybe this is a personal opinion, but I don't particularly enjoy watching snooker and golf. I know a lot of people do.
Well, okay, easy, settle down. Sorry, go on.
They might be quite fun to play. I might quite enjoy playing them, but I don't really want to watch them.
So I don't think the spectator experience is necessary. Like something I gestured at was that if you say come up with your own house rules for like a Super Monkey Ball tournament, I don't necessarily say you'd necessarily be able to call yourself an esports tournament organizer straight away, but What I'm arguing is that the process you've gone through is like a microcosm of the actual process of developing a sport. That a lot of the same kind of creative urges, like how do we add rules to this thing to make it fair and competitive and interesting, apply regardless of whether or not there's a spectator there. Actually, because that did, when I was writing this, that did occur to me that like, is sport just defined by if someone's watching? Like, is that when it becomes sport? And I don't think it really is, because otherwise every Let's Play you watched would be a sporting event, and I don't think they are. So I think it is everything to do with the kind of communal process of rule creation that surrounds that, not something about the spectator experience itself.
I thought another one as well, which is I sometimes heard of scuba diving referred to as an equipment intensive sport, right? But you can't really spectate that.
No, but it's still subject to rules, right? Like, it's still subject to restriction. I actually know so little about competitive scuba diving that I'm going to wing it the rest of the... I have no idea. I mean, maybe it has no rules. Maybe they just swim down there and they're having a nice time, in which case that's not a real sport, and the scuba diving commentary community can be angry at me on Twitter. But presuming that competitive scuba diving has rules, and those rules pertain to how you do the swimming, then according to what I'm saying, oh, fuck it, yeah? Probably yes. Yes.
During the talk, the definition of a sport as rules, not a script, effectively.
Yeah.
So, could you envision, or is there possibly a world where you have role-playing games and live-action role-play as a sport?
That's really interesting, because I suppose the other thing I missed, and that's a really good way of pointing it out, is that it would need a competitive context. There would need to be a way to resolve those rules that you've established for your live-action role-playing session or your Dungeons & Dragons session in a way that created a winner. You know, if you engage with whatever the combat system is that you derived for your session, if you engage with that in a way that determined this side has come out on top, then I don't see any reason why that isn't analogous to something like Dota, or like, I play a lot of, Blade Symphony, which is a competitive online sword fighting game that actually absolutely ticks all the boxes that I say. But if those same systems were applied to a narrative-driven game, you'd probably call it an RPG. So, yes, absolutely, but as long as there's a victory state for one side, not the other. Yes.
Just kind of follow up from that, does it have to be a PvP victory state, or can it be a PvE? Like for D&D, like in one setting you have the team wins over monsters, but then in a larger setting you might have two different teams playing the same scenario, and one team beat the monsters faster and therefore win over the other team. Is one sport.
Speedruns are another really interesting example of this, of what is essentially a player versus computer experience that has a really clear competitive, like if you watch competitive speedruns when they divide the screen into quadrants and it's like how fast can you get through Super Metroid, that's another good example of people battling a computer but with a kind of external rule set that helps sort of frames it. So again, it would need that external rule set, I believe. Like you wouldn't just, I mean, you could say that, hey, if we can get through this D&D scenario faster than the other group, then we win. And you've basically imitated a lot of those same structures because you've created a rule that helps to determine what comes after that point, right? Yes, the back.
Don't have a strong opinion on this, but your sort of perspective of rules versus script, would you consider pro wrestling as a sport?
This is, so I don't want to wander into this because, as I've mentioned on the talk, I am quite small and pissing off wrestlers. No, I actually don't know enough about pro wrestling. Like, I was vaguely aware of it when I was a kid and never really followed it. I have mates who are really into it. I don't know enough about how much of it is staged and scripted and how much of it is legitimate competition. I would say that if it's a live show which has a fundamental script that is adhered to, then no, that falls outside of a definition of sport. It'd be like having a play that involved two characters playing tennis on the stage. You wouldn't say that they were necessarily. It wasn't a sporting event at that point. It was a play where people were playing tennis. So no, but nobody hit me. Yes.
By that definition, surely things like dancing, where you consider that as a sport, like for example ballet, but it's choreographed, so you can see it as scripted.
There is a, I suppose actually, so this would actually be an interesting take on it. So there are a lot of sports that are judged, where the rule set has been built to allow the sport to function, like gymnastics, for example, like dance, like ice skating, rely on an external panel of judges who operate according to rules and criteria existing outside of what is essentially a choreographed performance. So actually, there could be a sport based on pro wrestling where it was a bunch of judges held up cards to say that their pretend fight was better than the other guy's pretend fight, that I think would constitute sport at that point, if that makes sense. Like, yeah, you can have, I mean, the same would also, I think, apply to the speedrun thing, where functionally a given run of Zelda has to follow these exact beats because that is the perfect way to do it. It's choreographed in that sense, but not everyone is capable of it, right? There's a fundamental skill difference between different people, and therefore different scores can be registered and so on. Is that it? Okay, I have to wrap it up there, but thank you very much for your time, guys. Thank you for coming.